Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. In today's presentation, we're going to talk about an event, a controversial subject that may or may not have happened depending on perspective. Yes, I'm talking about the Great Flood. With all the evidence we do have, I'm fully convinced that there was a global flood. However, I do agree that there are many specifics about this flood that are unanswered, such as how severe this flood actually was. All we really have is artist renditions, but is it actually accurate? In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were open, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Springs of the great deep. I don't know about you, but this is a remarkable description of what we would call volcanism. Why? Well, the word spring comes from the Old English word springan, meaning to leap, burst forth, fly up, spread, or grow. Based on that definition, what does the Bible mean when they say springs of the great deep? Groundwater? Sure. But you could also mention volcanism as well. When magma makes its way out of the ground, you have a well or spring of a liquid substance. Now, there are several problems that need to be addressed if we are to believe that this event actually happened. Now, the purpose of this video isn't to debunk the arguments and objections of naturalists for the sake of ridicule or mockery of the media's worldview, but to review their objections and see if we, specifically I, can explain them according to this historical ancient legend. No, I'm not going to resort to Answers in Genesis nor Institute for Creation Research, and I'm not a geologist, but if you are, don't be so quick to dismiss my claim. You can test it for yourself, but just hear me out, okay? Have an open mind. For all you know, I might say something that you might have not thought about before. All the things that I mentioned come from the original articles made from National Center for Science Education, and the links will be in the description so you can look at it and make your own conclusion. So folks, let's get into it. To answer, this is true. Though I'd argue that this doesn't disprove a great flood, this could just mean that this wasn't the result of the global flood, but after the flood. For several centuries, in theory, this took 1,500 years. During that time, Earth was in a recovery stage after the flood. But unfortunately, this would result in very unusual and radical climate changes. Now, how does this relate to desert deposits? Well, quite simply, some areas would experience a lot of snow and ice, others a lot of rain, and some would experience extreme desertification and dust storms. In order to have these deposits, the climate would need to be unusually strange. You know, come to think of it, this explains how humans were able to migrate from the eastern hemisphere to the west. They simply crossed over dry areas of land that are now occupied by the sea. Sound familiar? The conclusion that this formed during Devonian times is really just from radiometric measuring. Because of radiation, radiometric dating is garbage. You can't pick and choose which radiometric readings are more accurate if every single one of them have different readings. That's showing favorites. There's a volcano in Yellowstone that buried 27 forests. The only thing we disagree with is how long it took to recover each of these forests. Now, I already know some of you are already freaking out and angrily typing into the comment section or just huffing about how wrong I am. But just listen, okay? For the sake of argument, let me give an alternative explanation for the fossilization of these 27 forests. So let's say for the sake of argument, this volcano erupted around 4000 BC. The surrounding forests were buried. Over the course of 100 years, the forest made a near full recovery. However, it ends up being fossilized by another eruption. The forest again also recovers within 100 years or a little more than that. These events repeat 25 more times with about the same pacing and severity. By the 27th eruption and forest recovery, The year is around 1300 BC, and this entire chain of events have lasted for 2,600 to 2,900 years. So apparently it doesn't actually need to take tens of thousands of years. So where did this claim that these fossil forests are actually at least 70,000 years old come from? And what about past eruptions in general? How do we know that they're hundreds of thousands of years old or older? Of the four, the first three are not as reliable as mainstream scientists want to believe. Why? Because of radiation. And if all of that is so, it seems like the best way to know without a doubt for how we got our rocks is either by a supernatural perspective or an eyewitness observation. Are they seriously implying that the flood was that violent? That's not really a valid argument if you think about it for 20 seconds, especially if these flood legends don't specify as to how long it actually took for the waters to completely cover the earth. Due to the rock formations themselves, if there was a great flood, it was much more mild, with temporary relief periods for certain areas of Earth. Relief periods only occurred as the floodwaters were slowly rising higher, not while the waters were receding. This can happen more than once for the same region, and these played a role in fossilizing animals caught in the act, in the formation of raindrop craters, evaporites, and shales. It should be clear that all of our coral reefs, without exception, did not come from the flood, but after the flood. The tallest coral reef in the world, the tallest coral, is 1,640 feet tall. As they state, so, perhaps at some point after the Great Flood, coral could grow much faster, anywhere between 10 and 62 millimeters instead of the usual 1.0 to 2.5 millimeters per year. That isn't really out of the question if the conditions were right, maybe with aid from God. Why? To help the sea life repopulate quicker. Now when it comes to the skyscraper reef, that's where it gets controversial and cryptic. The only images available is footage of the top of the structure and satellite imagery. Looking at this imagery, does this really look like an unusual coral reef? Why didn't they film the base so we can know with absolute certainty what the base actually looks like? The shape of this coral gives the impression that the base really isn't a reef at all, but rather a tall buried structure. Well, if it wasn't a reef, what was it then, huh? I'm not sure. It could be an unusual mountain formation, or a tall extinct sea vent that has since grown a coral reef at the top. With the type of world we live in, I wouldn't be surprised if this skyscraper reef theory was a cover-up to hide its actual identity. It took 150 days until the rain and volcanism finally stopped, so how can you say this happened overnight? As I said before, this entire period was much more mild than we expect it and portray it to be. Just enough time for most of the rocks to form as if they formed through millions of years. For the sake of argument, let's say that most of the evaporites and shales formed during the Great Flood. But how can this be if evaporites and shales take a long time to form? Well, we both know what causes water to evaporate, so how can evaporation be sped up? I'll tell you how. By heat. In order to speed up the formation of evaporites, you need warm water, a heated surface, and a period of little rain. And this is what can exactly happen during relief periods. Most of the minerals that make evaporites can survive temperatures higher than 40 degrees Celsius, but the exact temperature can vary depending on the minerals. One possibility is that these minerals in a large lake could sink and collect to the bottom faster because of the ground heating up, also warming up the water. Another possibility is that a wave of warm water from a tsunami makes its way to a basin before evaporating quickly. Either of these processes could take anywhere between 10 and 15 days. It really depends on how hot the water and ground is, and what minerals were used to make the evaporites. Shale? It's just mud, clay, and silt. Does that really need to take thousands of years or more? No. Either of these could happen more than once before the sea level takes over. By the time the sea level does reach the evaporites, a considerable layer has already been formed. In the end, the finely grained, evenly layered shales are nothing more than small deposits that would have formed quickly due to the ground heating up, each layer heating up once another layer is complete, not years of time and gradual climate time. But process of sedimentation and evaporation are so slow that thick shale and evaporite deposits could scarcely have formed overnight. Says who? Says present observation, perhaps? Because of this present observation, it must be like that. See what I mean? That's circular logic. That's a refusal to think outside the box, regardless of what may have happened or could have happened.